Hi, everyone. What I want to talk about today is the transformation from the Umayyads to the Abbasids. So we've been talking in different senses about the Umayyads, about the two civil wars of the Muslim community, about how they transformed Islam in the process, etc. But the Umayyads ultimately came to an end in 750, and a new dynasty ended up taking power. But it was um, unexpected, let's say. So just a quick review of kind of the dates, information we've been going over. These are just, again, just facts. But so like 570s, Muhammad is born. We talked about when he started receiving the revelation. He migrates to Medina, eventually consolidating power until he retakes Medina. By 632, Muhammad has died, and the first successor to him, Abu Bakr, takes over. Um, he only himself lasts for about 2 years, but this starts the initial conquests, and we talked about the nature of those conquests, where they occurred, what motivated them, etc. And then there was the first civil war between Ali, the fourth Amir al-Mu'minin, the fourth leader of the believers, commander of the faithful, and Muawiyah. And the end, Muawiyah sort of wins by default, and he starts the Umayyad dynasty. Technically, the branch called the Sufyanid branch, because Muawiyah was the son of Abu Sufyan. And Abu Sufyan was one of the people of Mecca that rejected Muhammad initially, but then accepted him when he reconquered the city or retook the city. Then there was another civil war at the end of Muawiyah's death. This time, there was kind of a three-way or four-way fight between different rivals. In the end, an Umayyad named Abd al-Malik eliminates his rivals, sets up the Umayyad dynasty, the Marwanid branch, and continues for quite a long time. His reign is relatively stable, and so is that of his successors. And we talked about the Dome of the Rock being started, the mosque in Damascus. And during this time, there's still large campaigns, right, against Byzantium, and then further into the Transoxania, and Iberia. But already by the 1730s, 40s, tension is building. And ultimately, there is something called the Abbasid Revolution in 750. Now, we're going to figure out what is the Abbasid Revolution and who are the Abbasids. The Abbasids are basically the dynasty, let's say the larger family that took over control of this one united Islamic empire in 750. It was a line of the Quraysh tribe who claimed to be descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, but through his paternal uncle. So they weren't direct descendants of him. That only went to Ali, who was his cousin and who married the Prophet Muhammad's daughter. And Ali's children were kind of direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, but there was a general sense that they were kind of tied to the Prophet Muhammad, or at least somewhere in his family, as we'll see. Most of them were living in a town called Humayma in what's today Jordan. And they would start an Abbasid dynasty that would last from 750 to 1258. Those dates are a bit crazy. They actually only had like 150 years of true power, but basically until 900, until things started falling apart. But they managed to kind of hold on to Baghdad, and as the ceremonial role continued for a long time. And as we'll see, it's under the Abbasids that we capture the notion of a sort of classical age, that a lot of the basic foundational ideas in Islam and Islamic civilization, or Islamicate civilization, as we'll talk about, were founded. Now, why do we call it an Abbasid? So that's the Abbasid part. Why do we call it a revolution? In a sense, why not just a fight between different dynasties? Because it was an attempt, according to some, to reconstruct the Islamic polity to reintegrate rulers and ruled under the leadership of the family of the Prophet. So the idea here is to reimagine what leadership is. And this is ultimately kind of what many of these debates and civil wars were about in the previous century. Like, who deserves to be the leader? What qualities should they have? What standards should they be judged against? Is it just based off of piety, about efficiency? Is it about connection to the Prophet Muhammad? Which of these is going on? And remember, at this time, the Islamic Empire, and this is really the only time that will be disunited, essentially, even though, again, this is very loosely administered. It ranges basically from Spain to North Africa, all of Arabia, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Central Asia, and what's today Sindh, like so Pakistan. Now, the interesting thing here is that the Abbasids claimed that they're going to bring about justice and change the nature of this Islamic empire by putting someone on the throne who was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. The weird thing is that they weren't, as I pointed out, direct descendants. They weren't Alids, so they weren't descended from Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, and his daughter Fatima. Instead, they were kind of a part of a broader family. And this is because, why did they focus on this? Because I think there was still a very strong idea, and we saw this in different moments under Hussein and under different figures, that only a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad could fix all the problems with the realm. But why were people unhappy with the Umayyads? This is difficult to pinpoint, but there's a few different things here. One is the fact that they had introduced under Abd al-Malik the term Khalifa, caliphs, right? They're kind of deputies of God. They, to some degree, took on greater roles in the religious administration, and it made it difficult to disagree with them or to critique them, even though there was a strong tradition within kind of Arabia and pre-Islamic Arabia of kind of direct political participation by everyday people. In this case, it seemed like it was just difficult to challenge them. I think more importantly, though, the fact is that the Umayyads, because they had moved their capital to Syria, to Damascus, became dependent on the troops of Syria. And the troops of Syria were more organized, better paid, and more efficient than all the other troops in different areas. And they were essentially used to put down provincial rebellions, to stop fights against challenges to the Umayyads. But in doing so, they had to reduce the payrolls of other troops. And remember, at this point, we still have garrison cities. We still have now like third generations of Arab troops stationed and expanding in different parts on the very edges of what's kind of Islamic world. And we have kind of new soldiers drawn from Iran, from other places, some of them who are converts, some who were traditionally Persians or some other group that have switched in. But at this point, the Syrian contingent is the strongest, but they become too reliant on them. And in doing so, basically they alienate other parts of the army. Now, within the Umayyad army itself, and especially in Syria, there was a big division between essentially northerners and southerners. The northerners were called the Qais, and the southerners were called the Yaman from Yemen, Qais. I don't remember what it's from. And this kind of random factional division, which stems from the supposed origin of the troops in pre-Islamic times, started tearing apart the army, but also the government itself. Certain governors and eventually certain caliphs were associated with certain factions at each point when people were just attacking factions just out of mutual hatred. The government stopped working or the army stopped working because different factions stopped wanting to fight or cooperate together. When one caliph or governor or administrator came into power, he would often be from one faction and fill the positions in that province with people of that faction. And then if the faction shifted, then that governor would be tortured and money extracted from him, etc. And all of his appointees would be dismissed. So that kind of factionalism, which is a bit hard to imagine, but came to define and to transform the Syrian army. And because the Umayyads were so dependent on these developments on the Syrian army, it became difficult to use it as an efficient tool of governance. The other thing, of course, is that they increasingly had to use the Syrian army to put down revolts in Iraq. Iraq contributed much more tax revenues and was much richer than Syria. Syria, I think, as one of your textbooks said, contributed about 5% of the tax revenues of the Islamic Empire, whereas the revenues from Iraq were like 20 times that. So the Umayyads were dependent on Iraq, but were not centered in Iraq. And therefore, they had to rely on efficient army usage, but it just became harder and harder. And finally, there was also increasing number now, about 150 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, or let's say 120 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, there's increasing number of non-Arabs who wanted equal treatment, were wanting to be treated as Muslims. Now, these non-Arabs, which are called Mawali, because they became clients of Arab tribes or Arab leaders, never rebelled, and they didn't look for their own leaders as converts. They were usually sufficiently happy to work with Arab generals and leaders, etc. But they formed an increasingly large contingent, and they wanted to bring about a more just society. So together with these things, basically overtaxation by the Umayyads, the fact that the army itself had stopped being efficiently run because of factionalism, which even led to the killing of one of the caliphs. And it's a general dis-ease about the nature of rule and who was actually running the place, led to a large-scale rebellion. Just a bit more about taxes. Again, this is the problem that happened with converts. So initially, Muslims were paying a zakat. If you remember, zakat was a sort of tax paid for previous sins placed on polytheistic converts. But it turned into a sort of just general tax on Muslims, and the number of Muslims was minuscule compared to the number of conquered peoples who were generally not Muslims. So the non-Muslims paid a poll tax, and anyone who owned land paid a land tax called the kharaj. The non-Muslim poll tax was called the jizya. But over time, as Muslims started settling down, intermarrying, interacting, and owning land, there was a question, should the Muslim landholders pay a land tax, because they were technically, as Muslims, sort of exempt from taxation. And initially, it was just the non-Muslims who were paying it. But now, as more and more landholders became Muslims, what happens to them? What should we do with the converts? And so this one solution was to essentially say that land tax is taxed. Land is taxed regardless of the religion of of the owner. And this, again, increased revenues, but also created a lot of dissension. And one thing to keep in mind, this is a large empire, but it's not centrally run. A lot of these places just had governors sent out who had sometimes their own troops, but often didn't have a strong power base. The only strong power base the Umayyads had were the Syrian troops, which had to be paid heavily. And so it was often hard to, let's say, demand that certain things be done. All they can do is try to keep down rebellions and collect taxes without pissing off the population too much. Now, the descent started, at least in the traditional story, in three places. One is Homayma, which you can't even see on this map, is the Abbasid hometown in Jordan. Not really an important place in any ways. The other place is Kufa. This was the traditional center, a place that had rebelled and fought for Ali and Hussein, the son of Ali and the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. And once again, people there were pushing for a vision of leadership that was centered on the Prophet's family. And the other places was basically Khorasan, which you can see here. It's what you can think of as Western Iran today, but also large portions of Central Asia, Afghanistan, etc. Now, why was Khorasan the space of rebellion? Well, one, it was a relatively rich province. It generated a lot of tax revenues. And it had a lot of, therefore had more settlers, more Arabs coming there over many generations. More converts had emerged there who wanted kind of equal treatment. And there was a lot more integration with the local population in different ways. More importantly, though, it was also more militarized as a frontier, so people were more actively involved in putting down rebellions or fighting against non-Muslim polities. And so they were more mobilized militarily. And ultimately, because they were being paid less, though, despite being on the frontier, they were also resentful of the Syrian core. This whole thing is very complicated, but basically there seems to have been a lot of secret agents, secret missions, things like that being sent back and forth between Kufa, Humayma, and parts of Khorasan, places like Marv, and other major cities with garrison towns. Long story short, eventually a sort of client of the Abbasids emerges, this man called Abu Muslim, which we know very little of. But he was incredibly efficient as a leader and as a general. And he's the one who kind of starts the rebellion and knocks out and kind of brings the Abbasids to power. And the Abbasids at this point are not calling for themselves to be put in power. They're just calling for, let's say, a general figure. This rebellion was started for a general figure from the house of the Prophet Muhammad. This is Marv today. There's not much there. It's in Tajikistan. I think it was destroyed in later centuries. And it's important to keep in mind that during this period, in 600s, 700s, being part of the so-called Prophet's family didn't literally mean descended from him directly. It just meant being part of his larger clan, the Hashim clan. And so we have different people claiming to be descended from him, and they were, like we have, for example, a rebellion by Mukhtar, which tried to put into power a man named Muhammad al-Hanafiya. Al-Hanafiya is the name of the slave from the Hanafi tribe. And so Hanafiya is like the female ending. So here it's a descendant of Ali. So not from a slave. So it's not someone who's directly descended from the Prophet Muhammad, because that could only happen through Prophet Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. But it was seen as close enough in an equivalent of being part of the family. Then we have people like Abdullah bin Muawiyah, a descendant of Ali's brother. And so the Abbasids supposedly, and this is very unclear, claim to be working for just an unspecified member of the Prophet's family. but they wouldn't tell who it was until they kind of came to power, supposedly for fears of retribution, etc. Now, within this, there's a variety of different ways, ideas about, well, which member, there's a lot of people who are part of the Hashem clan. So how do you decide which one is fit to rule or to be chosen? One idea is hereditary succession. So whoever is actually descended from Ali, and then from Hussein, etc. And there were still descendants at this time. Then there was designation by a previous leader. So whoever was in charge before would give leadership to who they chose. And then there was an idea that leadership belonged to whoever was brave enough and capable enough of seizing leadership. So if someone was able to start a rebellion successfully, then they should. And if they were able, if God really supports them, then they'll be successful. Now, what this leads to is essentially this whole thing basically starts in Khorasan, and then the Khorasan army marches out to conquer the Damascene army of the Umayyads, and they end up defeating them quickly, transforming them. And the last of Umayyad Caliph runs away. He seeks shelter in Cairo, but is hunted down. If I remember correctly, the house of the Abbasid family now rises up, emerges, and says, well, yes, we were the ones kind of leading all this. They're declared caliphs by the Kufans and by the Khorasanis. And the very first one takes what's called a Regnal name, so a name as a king, different from his actual name. He calls himself Al-Safah, the blood spiller. He only reigns for 4 years, but most of what he does is actually just go around killing all the Umayyads that are left. There's one that's left over, one descendant, and he runs away and establishes himself in Spain and restarts the Umayyads over in Spain. In the process of this revolt, though, they marched with black banners against the Umayyads. And this idea of marching with black banners to revive Islam and revive the community of the Prophet is potent. And that's why, for some reason, that's why ISIS, if you remember that from a few years ago, created a flag, a black flag, which is supposed to evoke the black flag of the Abbasids. So just as they are, marching to reconquer Syria, they would be doing so to reestablish the community or a true, just Islamic society. At this point, after the Abbasids kind of formally declare themselves as the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad that were going to be leading this new rebellion, it still wasn't clear who exactly was going to take charge. There was still the Khorasani army, which is the most powerful part, led by Abu Muslim. Then there were the Kufans, and then there was the Abbasids himself, who had a relatively minimal army and following. Al-Mansur, Al-Safah dies, and another caliph takes over named Al-Mansur. He's ultimately able to eliminate his enemies. He uses Abu Muslim to defeat his rivals, and then has Abu Muslim killed. And then he breaks from tradition. He doesn't go back to Baghdad. Instead, establishes a new capital in doesn't go back to Damascus. He establishes a new capital, a new city in Baghdad, what's called the Medinat al-Salam, the city of peace. Now, why did he set up a new city? Well, one is just because Iraq was by far the richest area. The tax revenues from the agriculture there were just much higher than anywhere else. And it was important for the capital and for the government to be there. So rather than what the Umayyads had to do, which is to send the Syrian army over to Iraq to put down revolts, they could center themselves in Iraq. In fact, if you look at where they built Baghdad, it's essentially between the point that's closest distance between the Tigris and the Euphrates, built on the Tigris, but very close to the Euphrates. And it was actually built. There's a round city, the so-called Medinat as-Salam, the city of peace, that was built along astrological planning. And this was kind of the palace of the caliph, kind of a city within the city that was meant to house all the people who supported him, the sons of the army, the Khurasani army, who were eventually became the central army of the Abbasids. And around them there was all these canals, in other neighborhoods. And in fact, you can think of Baghdad more like Venice or something. There would have just been constant canals and movement and shifting through this area. It would have been very, very green, and everything would have been built by mud brick. And because this was a new capital, it grew very quickly. So why start a new capital? As I pointed out, one part is just to be closest to the tax revenues, but it was also a way to reward supporters. What you could do is essentially give your biggest generals or supporters grants of land within the capital, and then these could essentially be developed as real estate and then sold off or rented out. And so this was one way to reward supporters, and it would be the same logic behind the creation of a new capital in Samarra about 100 years later. As I pointed out, it's next to the tax centers of this Sawad area, the black lands, the rich irrigated lands of Iraq. But it was also very close to Khorasan. And remember, Khorasan was a rich province. It was also where the army that put the Abbasids into power came from. And it was important to keep a strong connection to that. By connection, it was still imagined very far away. It would have taken months to march from between Khorasan and Baghdad, but at least it was much closer than Damascus, and of course, much closer than Medina. And ultimately, by building a new capital, Al-Mansur could create a place that he could craft and control. This was obviously seen from the fact that it was built along astrological instructions. The Abbasids lasted for quite a while, but as I pointed out, there's really just a few generations that are important. Let's say between 750 and 950. Afterwards, they basically became placeholders or figureheads. So Al-Safah is probably the founding member. Al-Mansur is the man who founds Baghdad. Al-Mahdi, the rightly guided, is what his regnal name means. It's important because he's the father of two caliphs, Al-Hadi and Harun al-Rashid. Between Harun al-Rashid and Al-Hadi, there is a fight. It seems like perhaps Al-Hadi was poisoned or murdered, and Harun al-Rashid takes power. Ultimately, Harun al-Rashid signifies the kind of high point, as we'll see, of the Abbasids in the imagination. Let me see. It's kind of this moment in which all these stories go back to in the 1001 Arabian Nights, in the stories of Aladdin. This is obviously not what Baghdad is supposed to look like. It's kind of even built on a South Asian model. But this idea of the period of Harun al-Rashid and the period of Baghdad forms this like classical backdrop to so many stories, even into the 1700s and 1800s. Harun al-Rashid had two sons, Al-Almin and Al-Ma'mun, who were supposed to share power. It's always this doesn't work, and they split. They create a civil war. Al-Ma'mun ends up winning, even though based in Khorasan, he eliminates his brother. And after this very deep, difficult part, he's the one who's also very closely related to the kind of high point of the Abbasids. We'll talk much more about him. And also he had a brother named Al-Mutasib, who was a key helper in general of his reign. Al-Mutasib, as we'll see, starts a army of Turkish slaves, one that will kind of define and transform the nature of the army in later years. Now, we don't have to go through all these other guys, but it continues on for a while. What did the Abbasids do? How did they transform things? One of the things that they did is they established the role of a vizier. There was probably a vizier as an advisor. It's a word that comes from the Quran itself. But the idea is that you have someone who's in charge of government, that the government is kind of administering the bureaucracy and so forth, and is running the empire while the caliph attends to campaigns or does other more important matters, kind of like a prime minister to the king or so forth, even though the king would ultimately be much stronger in this case. And so there is one very famous dynasty of viziers, the Barmakids. They're originally from Balkh, which is today in Afghanistan. They were a family of Buddhist shrine keepers that had converted to Islam and from Khorasan, integrated themselves into the army, and then with that came with the Abbasids. And were very close to Al-Mahdi and Harun al-Rashid, to the point where they had the capacity to, unprecedented power, at least for a secretary or for a vizier. And at a certain point, Harun al-Rashid turns against him and eliminates the entire family. But for about 50 years, they really serve the Abbasids. And they lead and they develop an entire new section of government, let's say a very strong bureaucratic or scribal section of government. There had always been bureaucrats, of course, and the Arabs/Muslims early on just used whatever Greek or Persian bureaucrats there were. But here they show that they develop into essentially a unique identity, a corporate identity, one that has extreme power and is sometimes at odds with the military itself. And this is one of the major developments under the Abbasids, and we'll see what that relates to. Harun al-Rashid meets on occasion delegations of foreign dignitaries all the time. There's all sorts of different peoples coming to Baghdad, including a delegation from Charlemagne in France. I do want to, before I go deeper into anything, I do want to see some of the visions of what did Baghdad look like. Today, we don't have any pieces of Baghdad left, but we can actually find, we don't have any pieces of it left because it was all built essentially out of mud. There weren't many trees in Iraq. The trees that are there are small or palm trees, and palm trees are not useful for bearing loads. And so, and stone also was not easily available. So everything was built out of mud bricks. These mud bricks would essentially decay in the rain. And so everything had to kind of be rebuilt every 30 to 40 years on occasion. Many people lived in large apartments or apartments in multi-storied housings, probably 3 to 4 stories high. The roofs would be built out of the floors would be built out of palm trunks and then plastered over. And on occasion, when people would walk above it, the plaster would sprinkle down on you. But overall, it was a gigantic city, one that housed probably hundreds of thousands of people, probably one of the largest cities in the medieval world. This is a recreation by Assassin's Creed of Baghdad. I think that was just released relatively recently. They're supposed to have gone out of their way to make things historically accurate. So let's see. One thing to keep in mind, there probably was not benches or parks like this. People didn't sit on benches. They sat on the floor. It's only possible that there's these sort of mashrabiyah type of balconies made out of wood sticking out. These would be found in Cairo, medieval Cairo, and you can still see them if you go there today. Like I said, because everything was built out of mud brick, everything kind of fell apart and melted over time. And so there's nothing really monumental left from medieval Baghdad. Not to mention that the Mongols destroyed the city in 1258. It quickly kind of recovered, but it was already a relatively minor place by that point. The Abbasids had stopped being a major power. It also seems unlikely that they would have put tile on these areas. One, because it would have been stolen, but two, because this is like a later addition tied to the Timurids. Let's jump around to different parts. These should be the canals that permeated Baghdad and that people used to get around, and they used to move everything. And remember, it's always easier to move everything by water than to by donkey. So it's a beautiful game, but I'm not sure how much of this is accurate or particularly real. A lot of it's probably just artistic license, but it gives you a sense of probably what was possibly like. I think the buildings would have been higher, the streets would have been narrower, there'd been much less stuff, public stuff in the middle. The fountains would just be on the side if there weren't any. Um, you might have buildings like this, but they would be much closer together. So I'm going to end it with that. Thank you everyone for watching. In the next class, we're going to be talking about a specific Abbasid Caliph Al-Mamun and his vision and all the different transformations. But what we're going to talk about in the next few weeks is how a new form of Islamic civilization came to be during the 800s and 900s, one that kind of defined the basis of Islamic intellectual culture wherever Muslims went, from South Asia to the Balkans and elsewhere. Okay, talk to you soon. Bye.